So what is the attainment gap? Well, sorry, but before I answer that, can I answer another question very quickly, and that is, what's an attainment gap? So an attainment gap is just any difference in outcomes between different groups. So we have, attainment gaps based on or rooted in gender, disability, experience of the care system, things like that. It's a very well-known phrase, but it's also quite a clumsy one, and it can be unhelpful in many cases. It appeals to people who like things kept very, very simple, but sometimes keeping things very simple doesn't actually help anybody. Now, specifically, the phrase that you often hear from politicians, the poverty-related attainment gap, that is just the difference in outcomes between the richest and the poorest. And specifically in Scotland, actually, it's a reference to the difference in outcomes between people who live in the richest fifth of Scotland and people who live in the poorest fifth of Scotland. Now, the data behind that is not perfect. Some of the poorest people don't live in the poorest areas and vice versa. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use the terms richest and poorest just to try and keep things, manageable for now. So, the poverty-related attainment gap, how do we measure it? How do we know what it is? Unfortunately, the answer to that is there's no single way to measure it. And that is fair enough, because it is a complex issue, but it means that there's no, simple, straight, everyone agrees that's the data there, that's the figure that tells us where we are. We use different things. For primary school and lower secondary school, we tend to use literacy and numeracy data. For upper secondary school, broadly speaking, people tend to be looking at things like higher pass rates. There are other things that are used there, including the number of qualifications people leave with, but that data is really, really, really problematic. So the pass rates for National 5 and for higher tend to be popular as a view of this gap between richest and poorest. And in terms of once they leave school or when they're leaving school, we use something called positive destinations. So that's what we're going to look at: literacy gaps, numeracy gaps, what you might call exam gaps, and destination gaps as well. Very quickly, where did all this come from? Why do you hear politicians talking about this all the time, even when it seems to be getting shoehorned into it something else? It goes back to 2015. The Scottish Government had been rattled, shall we say, by some difficult education data that has come out. And this was when Nicola Sturgeon made her now kind of infamous speech saying that she wanted to be judged on her records about her ability, or her government's ability, to close this gap between rich and poor. They decided that they would scrap the existing measurement system that told us how bad things were, so we couldn't compare. They made a new one, which is what we now use, and it's not as good. They also went down the road of deciding to impose standardised testing, for example. The idea behind that direction of travel in education policy, whether people kind of realise it or not, is underpinned by this principle, I suppose, that the way you improve education is by focusing on the data generated by schools. But as we'll now see, that is a very, very flawed idea, to say the least. So we'll start by looking at literacy. Now, as I said, this the measurement system has changed. This data only goes back to your sort of 2016, 2017 periods. What you can see on the screen just now is the gaps for literacy at primary 1, primary 4, primary 7, primary overall, and S3 for what we call level 3 of curriculum for excellence. It only goes back to 2017 because the year before that it wasn't combined into literacy. I'll explain that in a wee second. But what you can see in that graph there is the situation. And that is, in a couple of those lines, you can see them coming down a little bit, and a couple of them look like they're going up a little bit. And then at the pandemic, obviously there's a gap in the data, there's been a jump after that, and then afterwards things start coming down again. If we look at just reading and writing, which lets us jump back an extra year to 2016, much the same. Actually, in that chart you can see just now, it's about 50-50. Half of them are higher than they were at the start, and half are lower, but we're always talking by relatively small differences. The biggest difference, I think, is about 3.5 percentage points, and it's only one of the examples. If you look at what you've got here now, this is numeracy. Again, much the same pattern, coming from 2016 right the way through to just now. The same kind of lines showing up there, the same gap, the same declines after COVID. If we move on from that and look at qualifications, that hires in National 5s, what you can now see on the screen is showing you the attainment gap in pass rates for National 5 and for higher. So between those who did and didn't get between an A and a C when they sat the exams. And you can actually see there is that those gaps were going up from 2016 leading up to 2019, and then the removal of exams in 2020 during the pandemic cut the attainment gap in half. That was obviously not acceptable, despite it being apparently a national mission in education. So the exams were reintroduced, and as you can see on the screen, they got us back up to apparently where we're supposed to be, into that kind of historic and it would seem increasing level of a gap between rich and poor in terms of exam outcomes. The last one to show you is the chart on the screen just now, and that is the difference in positive destinations, and that goes all the way back to 2010. You can see a decline from 2016, and fair enough, but there was an even steeper decline in the years prior to that. And there's a big health warning that's required with the positive destinations data on a couple of things. One of them is that 0 hours contracts are part of the equation here. Now, the SNP described 0 hours contracts as even exploitative, and yet 0 hours contracts are included as a positive destination. That's a major problem. The other most obvious one is that there's no distinction made in terms of where people do what we call higher education. People assume that's university, and it isn't, not in Scotland. In Scotland, a lot of higher education happens in colleges. The difference between people doing higher education in universities and colleges isn't captured in positive destinations data, despite the fact there is definitely going to be a divide there in terms of people's affluence or deprivation. So issues, as I say, with the positive destinations data. All that taken into account, is the gap being closed? Well, positive destinations, as I say, yes. Others look like some are going up, some are going down. It's maybe worth noting that at the recent SNP conference, First Minister Hamza Yusuf said, and quoting here, "We've seen the biggest ever reduction in the attainment gap on literacy and numeracy in primary schools in a single year." But what he's talking about is a year when those figures were coming down, as we saw in those charts, post-COVID. Many of the figures that we're looking at just now are in fact the same or higher than they were in 2016. If this policy were hugely successful, if we were well on the road to closing the gap after 8 years and a lot of money being spent on it, is this the kind of thing that we'd be having to focus on? Which I suppose would take us then to the real question, which is, can the gap be closed? Nobody wants to admit this. Nobody wants it to be true, more importantly. But neither of those things are particularly relevant to the reality of the situation, because the answer really is no. And it's easy to understand really when you think it through. Ask, what would it mean to actually close that gap, which was the initial promise way back when, to actually eliminate it? Well, that would mean getting to a stage where your background has absolutely no impact whatsoever on the outcomes of your education. And if that's the policy, if that's the position, then you believe that the right tests, the right announcements, the right threats to councils, the right data, the right combination of policies could achieve that, could achieve a situation where people's background doesn't manifest in their education at all. And that's obviously not true. Wealth always conveys huge advantages. Poverty always imposes huge disadvantages. Closing the gap's a fairy tale politicians like to tell the public. That gap between rich and poor, the idea that that kind of divide would manifest everywhere else in society, but somehow could be prevented from sneaking inside the walls of a school, is nonsense. And it's political nonsense as well. The thing is, the poverty-related attainment gap isn't even actually an educational issue. Not really. It's got very little to do with schools and teachers and testing and education policy and stuff like that. It's just what our horribly unequal society looks like when you view it through the prism of education. When you take that lens and look at, how we live, the attainment gap, the poverty-related attainment gap in schools is what comes out. And we all wish this wasn't true. You know, I taught for 12 years and would have loved for this to have not been true. And sure, you know, individuals can be helped beyond their circumstances, and they are all the time, every single year. And yeah, there are always exceptions to the rules, there are always outliers. But those exceptions and those outliers and those different individuals don't change the pattern. They don't change the reality for the overwhelming majority of people. As I say, we all wish that this wasn't the case. But the people who are telling you that that gap between rich and poor, this poverty-related attainment gap, can be, you know, seriously, substantially closed or even eliminated, are either delusional or they're lying to you. And to be completely honest, even after all these years, I've never actually quite figured out which one of them is worse.